My name is Lana Easton, and for most of my life, I was the invisible one. If you asked my family to describe me, they'd say I was soft, quiet, or maybe just off the radar. Not rebellious. Not loud. Just not them. And that was enough to make me a disappointment. We lived in Granbury Hill, an affluent neighborhood nestled in the shadow of towering city skylines. But I didn't belong to the towers, I belonged to the shadows between them. My parents, Vivian and Malcolm Easton, were titans in their own rights. My mother ran a national PR firm with her signature stilettos and an iron smile. My father was a judge, fair on the surface, but in our home, silence was his way of ruling. And then there was Chloe, my younger sister, practically born into perfection. She wore designer clothes like skin, networked before she could drive, and married Garrett Linford, a hedge fund prodigy who once made headlines for buying his mother a yacht just because. I was the exception. The librarian. The we don't talk about her too loudly daughter. After graduating from a small liberal arts college, I returned to our hometown and took a job at Briarwood Public Library, an ivy-covered building that smelled like old paper, dust, and everything sacred. I loved the hush of the place. The way people whispered secrets between rows of fiction and fantasy. It felt like home in a world that had always felt too loud. But to my family, my career was a failure before it ever began. "You're an Easton," my mother said once, lips tight as she sipped from a glass of imported wine. "You were born for influence. For headlines." "I was born to breathe," I replied quietly. She didn't answer. She just turned back to her phone, already halfway through her next judgment. My father didn't argue. He didn't need to. He just didn't speak. And somehow, that silence cut deeper than any words. But I learned to live with it. I learned to find joy in simplicity. Mornings spent unlocking the library doors. Shelving books by genre and title. Learning the stories of the people who walked through our doors. The elderly man who read war novels and always cried. The single mom who read cookbooks like fairy tales. The teenage girl who borrowed romance novels and doodled hearts in the margins. That was my world. Quiet, imperfect, real. And it was on a rainy Thursday in October that he walked into it. It had rained all night, soaking the sidewalk and turning Briarwood's gutters into little rivers. The leak in the library's back room had worsened, dripping relentlessly onto the archives. I had tried my best to mop it up when the front door creaked open. "Plumber's here," a voice called. I peeked around the shelf, expecting someone gruff and indifferent. But instead, there stood Cal Monroe, tall, shoulders squared, hair still wet from the storm. He looked like he belonged in a different kind of story altogether. Flannel shirt, well-worn jeans, boots splashed with mud. "You must be Lana," he said with a smile that reached his eyes. "I am," I replied, brushing my damp sleeve over my forehead. "It's pretty bad back here." "I've seen worse," he said. But instead of rushing past me with tools and grunts, he paused and glanced at a display on the checkout counter. "You a fan of Austen?" he asked, pointing to the worn copy of Persuasion beside the register. "Always," I said. "Anne Elliot might be the most misunderstood heroine of all time." He chuckled. "My sister loves her. Made me read it. Twice." Something about the way he said it made me smile. Cal wasn't just someone who fixed pipes, he listened. Really listened. Over the next few days, he returned to finish repairs, and each time he stayed longer. Once, he brought a dog-eared copy of A Man Called Ova, slid it across the counter, and said, "Page 213. You'll know when you get there." That was how it started. A plumber with a book. A librarian with a heart she thought she'd hidden too well. Cal began stopping by on his lunch breaks. He'd bring cinnamon rolls from the bakery down the street and sit beside me in the reading alcove where the light hit just right. We talked about everything: literature, old homes, how both of us liked solving quiet problems. He shared stories of working long hours, being raised by a widowed father, and learning how to rebuild things with his hands. He never looked at me like I was invisible. He looked at me like I was the answer to a question he'd been carrying around for years. One night, just after closing, he waited outside the library with 2 hot mugs of cider and an umbrella. "There's a spot I want to show you," he said. "It's a bit of a walk." "I like walking," I replied. We strolled through the quiet streets until we reached Ashford Hill, a grassy overlook on the edge of town. The clouds had parted, leaving streaks of moonlight on the river below. We sat on a bench, our shoulders brushing. "I don't want anything big," I whispered, surprising myself. "I don't want ballrooms or spotlight love stories. I just want peace. Something real." Cal didn't answer right away. He just reached out and took my hand. That's all I've ever wanted to. What I didn't know then was that this quiet moment would set the stage for the loudest storm of my life. Not from him. Not from us. But from the people who claimed to love me most, and only knew how to show it when I played by their rules. But for the first time, I had someone who would fight for me. And I was learning to fight for myself. I'd always known my family wouldn't approve. But what I didn't expect was how far they'd go to prove their disapproval, how deeply they would slice just to keep control. It started with dinner. The kind that felt more like a staged negotiation than a family gathering. White linen, crystal stemware, and the unsettling quiet of people who speak in polished scripts, not truths. We were at my parents' estate in Granbury Hill, Vivian's palace of perfection. Every detail from the way the napkins were folded to the chilled amuse-bouche screamed status. And there I was, sitting between my silent father and my smirking sister, about to disrupt the performance. I waited until the main course. Sea bass, saffron risotto, something with truffle oil. I pushed the food around my plate like a child buying time, until finally, I cleared my throat. "I'm getting married," I said. Forks paused midair. Glasses were set down with soft clinks. "To who?" my mother asked flatly, as if that mattered more than the announcement itself. "To Col Monroe," I said. "We're getting married in spring." Chloe's lips curled. "The plumber?" I met her gaze. "Yes. The plumber." Vivian gave a short, sharp laugh. "Oh, Lana. Must we do this here? Where else would we do it?" I asked, my voice calm. She leaned back in her chair, perfectly poised. "You're choosing a man who works with his hands over someone who could have given you a future." "He is my future," I said simply. "A kind one. A steady one. One that isn't defined by who can host the largest fundraiser or get featured in Society Lux." Vivian sighed as if I had just declared I was moving into a treehouse. "You were born for more than muddy boots and second-hand trucks, Lana." "I was born for peace," I replied. Malcolm, my father, didn't speak. Not even a glance. That, more than anything, told me how little support I had in that room. But I wasn't there for approval. I was there to draw a line. "We're planning something small," I said, "at St. Alden's Church. Just people who love us." "You're welcome, of course." Vivian didn't reply. Neither did Malcolm. Chloe snorted into her wine. By the time dessert was served, I was already gone. Not physically, but mentally. The walls around me had solidified into marble. Cold. Decorative. Unyielding. When I stepped outside that night, Cal was waiting in his pickup at the edge of the driveway. I climbed in, closed the door, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "How bad?" he asked gently. I turned my hand palm up, resting it over his. "They'll come," I whispered. "But it won't be to celebrate." The morning of our wedding, the sky was moody, clouds low and restless. But I felt warm. Maybe it was the way Cal had scribbled "I love you" more than every chapter you've ever read on a note he left by my dress. Maybe it was Martha, his mother, helping me button the gown in the little back room of St. Alden's. "You're ready," she whispered, smoothing a strand of hair behind my ear. "I've waited my whole life for this kind of quiet love," I whispered back. The chapel wasn't grand, but it was full. Friends from the library, Cal's co-workers, a few old neighbors who had watched us fall in love. White lilacs and eucalyptus lined the aisle. Tea lights flickered in mason jars. My dress wasn't designer, but it floated like poetry. Timeless. Gentle. My parents arrived last. Vivian wore navy, structured and sharp like armor. Chloe arrived in a shimmering champagne gown that looked more suited for an awards gala than a wedding. My father, as always, remained an expressionless shadow behind them. But I didn't care. Because when the doors opened and I saw Cal at the altar, eyes wide and full of unspeakable calm, the noise of my past dimmed. "You look like peace," he whispered when I reached him. And just like that, we began. The ceremony was simple. We wrote our vows. Cal promised to protect our quiet. I promised to never trade our truth for someone else's approval. When the minister said, "You may kiss the bride," the room broke into gentle applause. Everyone stood. Everyone except my family. Still seated. Still stone. But I was no longer asking them to rise. The reception was held in the small church hall, wood beams, floral centerpieces wrapped in lace, old jazz on vinyl. It smelled of home cooking and candles. Toasts began. Friends spoke of love that grew in stillness, not spectacle. Then the MC cleared his throat. And now, a few words from the mother of the bride. I froze. Vivian stood, lifting her glass with calculated grace. "Thank you all for being here on this rustic little occasion," she began. Lana's always walked her own path. Never quite interested in the things the rest of us found meaningful. And today, she's staying true to form. She's marrying a plumber. She laughed lightly. "No offense, California." The room tensed. I stood. "Stop." Her head tilted. "Excuse me? This is my wedding," I said. "You don't get to turn it into another platform for your pride. You are embarrassing yourself," she hissed. "No," I said firmly. "You've been embarrassing me my entire life. For reading instead of performing. For building a small life instead of buying a big one. And now, for choosing love that doesn't need to be gold-plated to be real. You're delusional," she snapped, stepping closer. "I'm free," I answered. Then, before I could brace, her hand cracked across my cheek. My face whipped sideways, the sting blooming instantly. Gasps filled the air. And then I felt her grab my hair, yanking with the fury of control slipping away. She dragged me through the room, through petals, spilled cider, broken applause. Chairs clattered. Someone screamed. Cal was there in seconds, ripping her away. "Don't touch her." My father didn't move. Chloe looked pale. Then a voice cut through the chaos. "Someone call the police." They arrived minutes later. Officer Sandoval and 2 deputies. I stood behind Cal, cheek burning, hand clenched. "I want to press charges," I said. Vivian was cuffed and escorted out, still simmering. My father didn't even follow. He simply sat down, smoothed his suit, and looked away. That night, Cal and I sat in our apartment, wrapped in blankets. His thumb traced the red mark on my cheek like it was sacred. "You okay?" he whispered. I nodded. For the first time in my life. "I think I finally am." The slap still echoed days later. Not just on my cheek, where a faint bruise bloomed like a shadow, but in my memory, in the stunned gasps, the fallen flowers, the sting of betrayal woven into my wedding day. I'd spent years thinking silence was safer. That maybe if I just kept my head down, read enough, smiled politely, they'd let me live my small life in peace. But that day, in front of everyone I loved, my mother tried to drag me back into the box she'd built for me. And I finally chose to burn it down. Pressing charges wasn't easy. Everyone warned me about family fallout. Some even suggested I drop it, call it a misunderstanding. But Cal never pressured me. He stood behind me, calm and steady. "If you want to walk away, I'll understand," he said. "But if you want to stand up, you'll never stand alone." So I stood. The official report described it plainly: assault and battery in a public setting, with multiple witnesses and video evidence. But for me, it was deeper. It wasn't about the slap. It was about years of erasure, of being reshaped, muted, minimized. My attorney, Danielle Reyes, was a powerhouse in a navy pantsuit and unapologetic red lipstick. She met with me in a quiet corner of her office and, after reviewing the footage and witness statements, leaned back in her chair and said, "This isn't going to be a drawn-out trial. The facts are clear. But it's still going to hurt. Are you ready?" I wasn't sure. But I nodded anyway. The courthouse smelled like wood polish and nerves. The fluorescent lights buzzed above us as I sat outside the courtroom with Cal and his parents. His mother Martha gripped my hand like a lifeline. His father Joseph offered me a silent nod of encouragement, the kind only kind men give. Across the hall, my parents sat stiffly. Vivian wore a cream blazer, her hair pulled back into a chignon so tight I wondered if it hurt. She looked like a woman walking into a business negotiation, not a courtroom. My father, Malcolm, stared straight ahead. No emotion. No acknowledgement. Chloe wasn't there. Apparently, she'd chosen to stay neutral. When we stepped inside, I took my seat at the front. The judge, a soft-spoken woman named Judge Macmillan, entered and immediately set a tone of quiet authority. Vivian pled not guilty. Danielle didn't flinch. "We'll let the footage speak." And it did. The courtroom fell into silence as the screen flickered to life and showed the scene, my mother rising at the reception, her speech dripping with judgment. My interruption. Her sudden movement. The sharp sound of the slap. My stumble. Her hand grabbing my hair. Me being dragged across a floor that had, only moments earlier, been filled with petals and promise. My heart pounded. But I didn't look away. When the footage ended, no one breathed for a moment. Even the court clerk blinked like she was just coming out of a trance. Witness after witness took the stand, Cal, Martha, the MC, even a florist who had been nearby arranging a bouquet when the chaos unfolded. They all said the same thing: it wasn't a moment of loss of control. It was deliberate. Calculated. She didn't stop until someone physically intervened, the florist said. Finally, it was my turn. Danielle led me to the stand. I looked at the judge, then my mother. "She's always cared more about control than love," I said, voice even. This wasn't new. It was just the first time anyone else saw it. I paused, swallowing hard. She didn't just slap me. She tried to remind me who she thought I was, her failure of a daughter. But I'm not. Not anymore. When I stepped down, I didn't feel broken. I felt whole. Vivian declined to testify. Her attorney tried to spin it as a family misunderstanding, a moment of emotional stress. But the judge didn't buy it. "I see no confusion here," Judge Macmillan said. "What I see is a pattern of coercive behavior culminating in public violence." She ruled guilty on all counts. Vivian was sentenced to 6 months in county jail, a $5,000 fine, and mandatory anger management counseling. The judge denied her request for early release due to her complete lack of remorse. As the bailiff moved toward her, Vivian finally turned and looked at me. Not with regret. Not even with hate. But with disbelief. Like she still couldn't comprehend that she no longer held the strings. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the steps. I didn't say a word. Cal shielded me with his arm, guiding me to the car. I climbed in and closed the door behind me like I was sealing off a part of my past. He turned to me. "Are you okay?" I stared out the window for a moment, then turned to him. "I will be." That night, we sat on the back porch of our apartment, wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea as rain tapped softly on the rooftop. "I never thought I'd be the woman whose wedding ended in handcuffs," I whispered. Cal chuckled quietly, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "I didn't think I'd be the groom who had to tackle his mother-in-law." I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. The worst part was over. The ache, the fear, the sting of being dragged backward, it was all behind me now. The bruise faded, but the lesson etched itself deep into my bones. I had always thought that walking away from my family would feel like failure. But it didn't. It felt like freedom. In the weeks that followed, strangers reached out. Messages poured in. People who had lived through their own versions of Vivian Easton, parents who used shame as a weapon, children who finally found the courage to say enough. And for the first time in my life, I no longer felt like a disappointment. I felt like a mirror, one that reflected back every person who ever stood up for themselves and walked into a new life. Not unscathed, but undefeated. A few weeks after the trial, life began to quiet. The dust had settled. The headlines faded. My bruises were gone, and the name Lana Easton no longer came with a footnote of scandal. But something lingered, a stillness that felt like the calm before a storm, only softer. Warmer. I wasn't afraid. I was just waiting for what came next. And apparently, Cal had been waiting too. It was a Sunday morning, and I was sipping coffee in my robe, my hair still messy from sleep, when he leaned against the kitchen doorway with that look, the one he always wore when something was bubbling behind his eyes. "You're up early," I teased. "Plotting something?" He smiled. "I want to show you something. Dress comfortably. But nice." "Nice for what?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "You'll see," he said, grabbing the car keys. 2 hours later, we were driving through the outer edges of Mosswood Valley, where the roads curled around manicured hills and hidden estates. I watched rows of private gates and manicured gardens roll by, confusion building in my chest. "This doesn't feel like coffee and donuts territory," I murmured. Cal just smiled and kept driving. Eventually, we pulled up to an elegant stone house surrounded by blooming rose bushes and a winding cobblestone drive. It was the kind of place I used to shelve in fairy tale picture books. Grand but quiet. Powerful, but not loud. "You know someone here?" I asked as we stepped out. "Yeah," he said, taking my hand. The door opened before I could question him further. "Welcome home, sweetheart," said Martha, his mother, standing on the grand porch next to her husband Joseph, both smiling like they had a secret the whole world missed. "Home?" I echoed, heart pounding. Cal's grip on my hand tightened. "This is where I grew up." He led me through the front door, and it hit me, the warmth, the scent of cedar and lemon oil, high ceilings with intricate molding, and shelves lined with antique books. It wasn't new money. It was legacy. On a side table, I spotted a photo of Cal in a black cap and gown, shaking hands with someone beneath a university seal, Harvard Business School. I turned slowly. "Wait. You went to Harvard?" "Dual MBA," he said with a shrug. "Finance and infrastructure." I blinked. "You're not just a plumber." He chuckled. "Technically, I was. My dad started Monroe Infrastructure Corp from the ground up. He made me work on the field crews for 2 years before I could step foot in the boardroom. Pipework. Blueprints. Mud. Everything. It's how we do things." He led me down a hall to a sleek, modern office with a brass nameplate on the door. "Calvin R. Monroe, CEO Designate." Inside were architectural models, strategy documents, and photos of infrastructure projects across the state. "You're the heir?" I whispered. "Of one of the largest infrastructure firms on the East Coast." Joseph stepped in, beaming. "He'll officially take over next quarter. But we always said, he needed to find someone who saw him for who he is. Not just for the company." I turned to Cal, stunned. "Why didn't you tell me?" He stepped close, brushing a thumb against my cheek. "Because I needed to know you loved me. Not the legacy. Not the title. Just the guy with calloused hands and a paperback in his truck." Tears stung my eyes. And I did. That's why this is real. That night, we sat on the back patio of the Monroe estate, overlooking acres of orchard trees, the air thick with jasmine and promise. The sun dipped low behind the hills, painting everything in gold. "You never needed to prove anything," I whispered, resting my head on his shoulder. "I did," he said. "But not to the world. To myself. I wanted a love that couldn't be bought. And I found it the day you handed me that library card." We laughed. It felt surreal. The woman who once shelved biographies by day and dodged insults by night was now sipping wine in a mansion, not because she married into money, but because she fell in love with a man who built himself on truth, not image. In the months that followed, Cal officially stepped into his role as CEO. But instead of just expanding highways and airports, he launched a new initiative, the Monroe Foundation for Learning Spaces. The first project? A series of modern community libraries in underserved areas. It was Lana's idea, he told the press. She brought stories into my life. I want to help bring them into others. He asked me to run the nonprofit division. I hesitated, leaving the public library felt like leaving a part of myself. But eventually, I said yes. Because this was bigger. I wasn't walking away from books. I was delivering them to the world. We called it the Reading Lantern. I spent my days visiting schools, overseeing projects, helping design warm, safe places where kids could read without judgment. Where kids like me, quiet, dreamy, overlooked, could feel seen. One morning, as we hosted the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the first lantern site, a little girl tugged my sleeve. She held up a picture book and asked, "Is this your library?" I knelt beside her and smiled. "It's yours." At night, Cal and I returned to a life that wasn't flashy but was full. We read stories to each other. Cooked too much pasta. Took long walks around the garden. He always came home from meetings in a suit, but by dinner time, he'd be barefoot and letting our golden retriever, Scout, chase him around the lawn. We were quiet people with a loud kind of love. My relationship with my father changed, too. Slowly. Carefully. One day, I received a short email. Just 3 lines. "You were right to choose love over image. I see that now. Dad." It wasn't a full apology. But it was honest. And for once, that was enough. Chloe began sending small gestures too, a bouquet on our anniversary, a baby gift months later when our daughter was born. She was different now. Life had humbled her in ways I'll never fully understand. As for Vivian, she moved. Out of state. Out of our lives. I never unblocked her number. Some doors are meant to stay closed. But my story? It had just begun. On our first wedding anniversary, I stood barefoot in the garden behind our home, our daughter in my arms, Cal's arms around us both. The sun spilled across the orchard, and laughter floated from inside where friends and family gathered. "This is it," I said. "The life I never dared to believe I could have." Cal kissed my temple. "And the legacy we get to build together." 1 year later, the world I lived in no longer resembled the one I came from. Gone were the crystal chandeliers, the sharp-edged silences, the measuring eyes that followed my every move. In their place were sun-drenched mornings, bedtime stories, and a little girl with her father's dimple and my bookish gaze, our daughter, Eliza. We lived in the same Monroe estate where I'd once stood stunned by its grandeur. But now, it didn't feel like marble and status. It felt like warmth. The walls echoed with laughter and soft music. The kitchen always smelled like cinnamon or sage. We'd turned the grand formal dining room into a reading lounge with plush chairs, tall shelves, and a handmade sign in Eliza's crayon scrawl that read, "Mom's Book Castle." Cal still wore suits to meetings, but when he came home, he was all bare feet and flour-dusted hands. He never missed story time. Never ignored a tea party. And no matter how many zeros followed his company's contracts, he still made time to read a book with Eliza every single night. I once thought a quiet life meant a small one. Now I knew better. Quiet didn't mean invisible. It meant intentional. Sacred. Real. The Reading Lantern, the nonprofit arm of Monroe Infrastructure, had expanded faster than we expected. Within a year, we had opened 12 community libraries and 4 mobile units across underserved areas in the region. These weren't just rooms with books. They were safe havens. Reading corners with pillows and quilts. Story circles with volunteers. Free workshops for kids and parents alike. My days were filled with visits to rural schools, video calls with teachers, and the kind of joy that fills your lungs until you almost forget to breathe. During one visit, a boy named Julian, about 9 years old, tugged my sleeve and asked, "Why do you care so much about kids like us?" I knelt beside him, smiled, and said, "Because someone once told me I wasn't enough. And I want to make sure no one tells you that." He didn't say anything at first. Then he hugged me, tight, and without warning. That hug stayed with me for days. My relationship with my father, Malcolm, had shifted from silence to something else, not perfect, but honest. After Vivian's sentencing and departure, he had taken time to soften. Maybe it was watching Eliza grow up. Maybe it was watching me step into a version of myself that couldn't be ignored. He started sending short, sporadic emails. Then holiday cards. Then came the day he drove an hour just to drop off a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that once sat in his study when I was a child. "I saved it," he said. "Thought maybe Eliza would want it someday." It wasn't a declaration. But it was something. A bridge. We were building it, one unspoken apology at a time. Chloe, too, had begun her own kind of journey. After her husband's financial empire collapsed, they moved into a modest townhouse outside the city. She started over, quietly, humbly. She reached out more often, at first awkwardly, then with growing sincerity. There were days she dropped off toys for Eliza, or called just to ask about nothing. And slowly, I let her in. Not because I forgot how she once mocked my love story. But because I knew what it felt like to be underestimated, and what it took to climb out of it. One afternoon, as we sipped tea on my porch, she looked around at the garden, at the books, at Eliza drawing chalk suns on the pavement. "You made a life out of what the rest of us threw away," she said. I didn't respond. I just smiled. She wasn't asking for a reply. She was naming something she had only just begun to understand. As for Vivian, I never saw her again. She served her sentence. Moved out of state, I heard. Her number stayed blocked, her emails unanswered. Sometimes I wondered if she looked back. If she regretted what she lost. But I never dug too deep. Some wounds are best left closed. Not out of bitterness. But because I chose peace over proof. I no longer needed her to see me. I had already seen myself. One spring evening, Cal and I sat under the arbor in our backyard, a soft breeze rustling the new blooms. Eliza had fallen asleep early, curled up with a dog-eared picture book in her lap. Scout, our golden retriever, lay snoring nearby. I leaned into Cal's side, our hands intertwined. "Do you ever think about how it all started?" I asked. He looked at me, that same quiet smile in his eyes. "The busted pipe?" I laughed. "Yes. That. But also the war we walked through to get here." He kissed my forehead. "Every day," he said. "And I'd walk through it again. Every step. Even the slap?" I teased. He chuckled. "Especially that. Because it knocked the last of the fear out of both of us." I nodded, my eyes stinging gently, not from sadness, but from everything we'd built since. The scars. The fight. The peace. We raised our glasses in a quiet toast. "To the life we weren't supposed to have," I whispered. "To the love we refused to lose," he said. And we drank under the stars, wrapped in truth. Months later, the Reading Lantern received a national award. I was invited to speak at a summit in Washington, D.C. The organizers introduced me as the librarian who turned pain into purpose. I stood at that podium, lights warm against my face, and told them this. "I once thought I had to shrink to survive. That silence was safer than defiance. That love meant making yourself smaller so someone else could stay comfortable. But I was wrong. Love is never loudest when shouted. It's strongest when it refuses to disappear, when it survives every attempt to be silenced." The room went quiet. And then, applause. As we drove home that night, Cal reached across the car and took my hand. "You're not the quiet one anymore," he said. "No," I replied. "I'm the one who made it out loud." because the life I built didn't need a spotlight. It needed honesty. It needed courage. And it needed love that wasn't afraid of being real.